Picture this, it's the summer of 1492. While Christopher Columbus is sailing across the Atlantic, convinced he's about to reach India, something equally world-changing is happening in what we now call New Mexico. Apache warriors are descending from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and yes, that translates to Blood of Christ Mountains, which tells you something about Spanish naming conventions, heading toward the Rio Grande Valley. They've been traveling for 3 days without water, following paths so old that their grandfathers learned them from their grandfathers. Paths that led to these strange adobe villages, where people grew corn in rows, so neat they looked like captured soldiers, standing at attention. Now the Apache had a name for these farmers. They called them the Mud House people, which is pretty much exactly what Pueblo means in Spanish, though the Apache didn't know or care about Spanish terminology. And here's what's fascinating. These raiders weren't coming for the corn. Think about that for a second. They're traveling through brutal desert terrain, risking their lives, and the corn, fields and fields of it, that's not what they're after. They considered it bird food, literally food for birds. What they wanted was the good stuff, turquoise, which was worth more than gold in their trading networks, cotton blankets that took months to weave, and slaves who could be traded with distant tribes for horses and other valuables. The raid itself happened exactly the way raids had happened for generations. Dawn, always dawn. That's when the Pueblo women would be starting their cooking fires, grinding corn on stone metates. These grinding stones that had been passed down through 20 generations, worn smooth by the hands of grandmothers and great-great-great-grandmothers. The Apache struck fast, grabbed what they could carry, and most of them got away clean. But there's always one guy, right? There's always that one warrior who lingers too long, gets greedy or careless, and finds himself surrounded. His name was Broken Arrow, and the Pueblo warriors who caught him made an interesting choice. They didn't kill him, even though they certainly could have. Death was too easy, too quick. Instead, they decided to humiliate him in a way that probably made perfect sense to agricultural people who had been dealing with these raids for generations. They forced him to watch their women make cornbread. Now imagine being Broken Arrow in this moment. You're a proud Apache warrior. You've just been captured during a raid. You're expecting torture, death, or slavery. And instead, these women are mixing ground corn with water and ash from burned juniper, patting it into flat cakes, and cooking it on hot stones. They're making bread right in front of you, as if you're a child who needs to learn a lesson. When they pushed this strange bread toward his face, Broken Arrow laughed. He actually laughed at his captors. It looked like dried mud, smelled like dust. And when he finally tasted it, because a spear point can be pretty persuasive, it was dense as clay and bland as sand. Even as they bound his hands with yucca rope, even as he was technically a prisoner who could be killed at any moment, Broken Arrow couldn't help himself. In broken Tanoan, which was the language these Pueblo people spoke, he mocked them. "You eat the food of birds and call yourselves men." That mockery should have been the end of the story. Apache warrior dismisses Pueblo cornbread, gets traded or ransomed, goes back to his people. Everyone has a good laugh about the Mud House people and their dust cakes. But history has this way of making fools of people who are too certain about things. That winter came hard, and I mean hard in a way that terrified people who had survived in this brutal landscape for generations. The buffalo herds, which were the Apache's primary food source, their supermarket and hardware store combined, moved south earlier than the oldest grandmother could remember. The piñon trees, which normally produced nuts that could sustain a family through winter, produced nothing. The prickly pear cactus, which was basically the emergency food of the Southwest, withered before it could fruit. Broken Arrow's band was starving. Their leader was a woman named She Brings Clouds, which tells you something important about Apache society that often gets lost in the movies. Women could be chiefs, could make the big decisions, could lead their people in times of crisis. And She Brings Clouds made a dangerous decision, the kind that could get her killed or exiled if it went wrong. She decided to trade for corn with the Mudhouse people, to trade for the bird food that Broken Arrow had mocked just months earlier. But what could she offer? The Pueblo people didn't need turquoise. They had their own sources. They didn't need cotton. They grew and wove their own. What they wanted, what they needed more than anything, was protection from Apache raiders, from people like She Brings Cloud's own band. At the winter solstice gathering at Pecos Pueblo, and we're talking about an event where 500 cooking fires burned, where traders came from as far as the Pacific coast. Hundreds of miles away, She Brings Clouds met with the Pueblo Council. Through hand signs and broken words, she negotiated something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. 20 large baskets of corn in exchange for her band's promise to defend Pecos from rival Apache bands. Turkeys guarding the henhouse, you might say, except this arrangement somehow worked. That corn kept them alive through the brutal winter of 1493. But it was what happened in the spring that really changed everything. A captured Pueblo woman named Cornflower, taken in a retaliatory raid because peace treaties only go so far, did something unexpected. She didn't resist or weep like other captives. Instead, when she watched the Apache women struggling with this unfamiliar grain, trying to prepare it the way they'd seen it prepared but failing miserably, she laughed. Not mockingly, not cruelly, but with genuine amusement, the way you'd laugh at a friend trying to use chopsticks for the first time. Then she showed them the secret. She taught them to soak the corn in water mixed with crushed limestone, a process we now call nixtamalization, though she didn't have a fancy name for it. This process did something almost magical. It made the nutrients in the corn available to the human body and made the grinding easier. Without this process, you can actually starve on an all-corn diet. With it, corn becomes a complete food. She showed them how to add wild seeds and pine nuts, transforming that bland dust cake into something that actually tasted like the land itself, like the Southwest concentrated into bread form. But most importantly, and this is the detail that matters more than anything, she showed them how to hide caches of corn in sealed pottery jars, buried where enemies would never find them. She taught them how to turn corn from a crop into insurance, from a joke into survival itself. The bird food that warriors had mocked was about to become the center of Apache life, and nobody, not Broken Arrow, not She Brings Clouds, not even Cornflower herself, could have predicted just how completely this yellow grain would transform the Apache people over the next 4 centuries. But first, those seeds hidden in captive women's hair would need to survive the arrival of the Spanish. And that's where our story gets really complicated. By 1600, a little over a century after that first mocking encounter with Cornbread, Apache bands across the Southwest had begun one of the most remarkable transformations in Native American history. And here's what makes it fascinating. No two groups changed in exactly the same way. This wasn't some top-down revolution where a king or council decreed, "We shall now become corn farmers." This was grassroots, adaptive, chaotic, and brilliant in the Gila River Valley, where the Western Apache roamed through some of the most unforgiving desert terrain you can imagine. A leader named Hawk Feather did something audacious. He established the first permanent Apache cornfields in a hidden canyon that caught rare desert rainfall. Now think about what permanent means here. For a people whose entire culture was built on mobility, on following game and raiding opportunities, on never staying in one place long enough for enemies to find you, permanent fields were revolutionary. They were also incredibly risky. Hawk Feather had learned the secret from his grandmother, and here's where the story gets even more interesting. She had been born Pueblo, captured as a child, and raised completely Apache. She moved between 2 worlds, carried 2 sets of knowledge in her head, and she taught Hawk Feather something profound. Corn wasn't just food. It was a living being that required respect, water, and constant vigilance. She taught him that you didn't just plant corn and hope for the best. You had to negotiate with it, work with it, understand it, and Hawk Feather's people did something that would make modern agricultural scientists very excited. They developed a new variety of corn that could survive on 12 inches of rain per year. 12 inches. To put that in perspective, most corn varieties need at least 20 to 30 inches. They bred this miracle corn from Pueblo corn, crossed with a hardy Mexican variety obtained through trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles. This was genetic engineering before anyone knew what genes were. Then the Spanish arrived, and everything got complicated in that special way that European colonization always made things complicated. In 1620, when Franciscan missionaries forced Pueblo peoples to grow wheat alongside their traditional corn, because apparently corn wasn't European enough, some Apache bands discovered they could raid for two kinds of grain. It's almost funny if it weren't so tragic. The Spanish were trying to civilize the Pueblo people by forcing wheat cultivation, and inadvertently they just made Apache raids more diverse. But 1680 changed everything. The Pueblo Revolt. If you don't know this story, you should, because it's one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in North American history. Pueblo peoples across the Southwest coordinated a massive rebellion, drove the Spanish colonizers all the way back to Mexico, and held them off for 12 years. 12 years of indigenous independence in what's now New Mexico, and during those 12 years, hundreds of Pueblo refugees fled to Apache bands for protection. They brought corn seeds hidden in their hair, sewn into their clothing, tucked into medicine bundles. But more than that, they brought entire agricultural systems, whole ways of understanding the relationship between humans and plants and the land. Women like Yellow Moon from Jemez. Pueblo married into Apache families and established the ceremonial calendar that marked planting and harvest times. They introduced sacred corn pollen that would become absolutely central to Apache girls' coming-of-age ceremonies. In these ceremonies, cornbread made from 4 colors of corn, white, yellow, red, and blue, represented the 4 directions and the 4 stages of life. This wasn't just food anymore. This was theology, philosophy, identity, all baked into bread. The most profound change, though, came through the children. And this is something that often gets lost when we talk about cultural exchange in abstract terms. Apache boys and girls born to Pueblo mothers grew up bilingual and bicultural. They were equally comfortable tracking deer through pine forests and tending corn in hidden fields. They could read animal sign and weather patterns with equal skill. And they developed new techniques that neither culture had used before. The trinchera, these stone terraces built across slopes to catch rainfall, and soil allowed corn cultivation in places that seemed absolutely impossible for agriculture. Imagine building a farm on the side of a mountain in the desert. That's what these kids figured out how to do. And these innovations spread through the complex Apache network of bands, carried by young people during seasonal gatherings, where marriages were arranged and knowledge exchanged like currency. By 1700, Spanish and French travelers were reporting something that confused them greatly. They kept finding Apache cornfields in hidden valleys, stretching from the Mogollon Mountains to the Davis Mountains of Texas. Each field was carefully concealed and fiercely defended. The Apache had become simultaneously the raiders everyone feared and secret farmers everyone underestimated. They had mastered what we might call dual-track living, maintaining their warrior reputation while quietly building agricultural security. But the spiritual transformation went even deeper than the practical changes. Traditional Apache stories began incorporating Corn Woman, a figure who taught that strength came not just from the warrior's bow, but from the farmer's patience. This was revolutionary thinking in a warrior culture. Patience, waiting, nurturing, these weren't traditionally masculine virtues in Apache society, but Corn Woman made them sacred. The Apache sunrise ceremony, which was and remains the most sacred ritual for young women, incorporated corn pollen blessings that connected femininity with the earth's fertility. Every Apache girl going through this 4-day ceremony would be blessed with corn pollen, marking her transition to womanhood through the very substance that the warrior broken arrow had once mocked. And the boys weren't left out. Male coming-of-age rituals added corn trials, where boys had to successfully grow, harvest, and prepare corn alone to prove they could provide for a family. You couldn't just be a good hunter or a brave warrior anymore. You had to show you could make things grow, could plan for the future, could feed people when the hunting failed. Even Apache names changed, and names are everything in Apache culture. Children born during good harvests received names like Corn Tassel, Yellow Pollen, and Sweetwater. The agricultural calendar was being written on human lives, marking time not just by seasons or raids, but by planting and harvest. So by the early 1700s, you had this remarkable situation. The Apache were still feared as the fiercest warriors in the Southwest. Spanish soldiers absolutely dreaded encountering them. But they were also farmers, agriculturalists, people with permanent fields and seed varieties and ceremonies centered around corn. They had absorbed Pueblo agricultural knowledge without becoming Pueblo people. They had transformed themselves without losing themselves, and they were about to need every bit of that agricultural resilience, because the next century and a half would bring catastrophe wrapped in manifest destiny. Bounties on Apache scalps, and systematic attempts to destroy everything they had built. The hidden fields that had saved them during hard winters would become targets. The corn caches that represented security would become vulnerabilities. And leaders like Mangus Coloradas and Geronimo would have to become agricultural strategists just as much as military tacticians. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand just how brutal the 1800s would be, and how something as simple as knowing where to hide a cornfield could mean the difference between survival and extinction. The 1800s brought catastrophe, and I want you to understand just how calculated this catastrophe was. When Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821, you might think things would get better for indigenous peoples. After all, Mexico itself was fighting colonial oppression. But here's what actually happened. The new Mexican government canceled Spanish peace treaties with Apache bands and did something that should make your blood run cold. They offered bounties for Apache scalps. 100 pesos for a warrior, 50 pesos for a woman, 25 pesos for a child. Let that sink in for a moment. They put a price on children's scalps. This wasn't warfare. This was systematic extermination, dressed up in economic incentives. Enter James Kirker, an Irish-American scalp hunter who turned genocide into a business model. Between 1839 and 1846, Kirker destroyed 17 Apache rancherias and their cornfields. And that detail matters, the cornfields, because Kirker and men like him understood something crucial. If you want to destroy the Apache, you don't just kill warriors. Warriors can be replaced. You kill the corn. You burn the fields. You destroy the food security that took generations to build. The Apache were forced deeper into mountain strongholds, places where even growing corn seemed impossible. But here's where that century of agricultural knowledge became survival itself. They developed what they called ghost fields. Small plots scattered across vast territories, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Each field contained different varieties of corn that matured at different times. This meant continuous harvest despite raids. If soldiers found and burned one field, there were always others, ripening in secret canyons miles away. Now we need to talk about Mangus Coloradas, because this man understood something that many Apache leaders were still learning. His name means red sleeves, and he stood 6 feet 6 inches tall in an era when the average man was 5'6". He was a giant in every sense, physically imposing and strategically brilliant. And Mangus Coloradas understood that agricultural self-sufficiency meant survival in a way that raiding never could. In 1840, Mangus established a network of cornfields stretching from the Mimbres River to the Chiricahua Mountains. We're talking about dozens of fields spread across hundreds of miles of some of the most rugged terrain in North America. Each field was protected by warriors who could appear and disappear like smoke. The Spanish had called this land La Apacheria, Apache land, and Mangus made sure they controlled it not just militarily but agriculturally. His daughter, Dostese, married Cochise, and this wasn't just a marriage. This was a strategic alliance that controlled corn production across southern Arizona. Together, they developed a system so ingenious that American military commanders would later study it in frustration. Each band maintained 3 types of fields. First, visible fields near camps that could be sacrificed during attacks. These were the decoys, the fields you let the enemy find and burn while feeling victorious. Second, hidden primary fields in box canyons, places where a dozen warriors could hold off hundreds of soldiers because the terrain itself was a weapon. These were the real food sources, the fields that actually fed people. And third, emergency seed caches buried in pottery jars that could restart agriculture after disasters. Even if everything else was destroyed, those buried seeds meant the Apache could plant again next spring. Then came the American period, and if Mexican bounties were bad, American policy was systematically genocidal. General James Carleton's 1863 orders were explicit: kill all Indian men wherever found. But Carleton's orders specifically targeted Apache cornfields for destruction. This was total war, and the battlefield was agriculture. Kit Carson, who had already devastated Navajo agriculture through his Scorched Earth campaign, turned his attention to Apache farms. And Carson was thorough, methodical, brutal. But here's what's remarkable. He underestimated Apache ingenuity. When soldiers destroyed visible fields, Apache farmers had already harvested and hidden most of the corn. When troops poisoned water sources with dead animals, which was a common military tactic, Apache engineers diverted streams through underground channels. They literally rebuilt their water supply while fighting a war. The most remarkable adaptation came from a woman named Lozan. She was Victorio's sister and one of the most formidable warriors in Apache history. But Lozan was also a shaman, a spiritual leader, and she used corn pollen in ceremonies to locate enemies approaching their fields. Now, whether you believe this worked through spiritual power or through heightened observation skills developed during ceremony doesn't really matter. What matters is that it worked. Farmers had time to harvest and flee before soldiers arrived. Let me tell you about the final agricultural battles, because they happened during Geronimo's resistance from 1876 to 1886. And Geronimo's story is usually told as a military narrative. The last Apache holdout, the fierce warrior who evaded thousands of American soldiers. But Geronimo's tactical genius extended to what we might call corn warfare. He maintained 17 hidden corn caches across the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico. 17. Each cache contained enough grain to feed 30 warriors for a month. Think about the logistics of this. Think about the planning, the secrecy, the trust required to maintain 17 hidden food supplies across hundreds of miles of mountain terrain while being hunted by 2 national armies. And Geronimo's band did something that shows just how adapted to agriculture they had become. They would strike American supply wagons, but they weren't primarily after weapons or ammunition. They were after corn seed. Specifically, they wanted American sweet corn varieties that matured faster than traditional Apache corn. Even while fighting for survival, they were thinking about agricultural improvement, about crop breeding, about harvest times. When General George Crook finally forced Geronimo's surrender in 1886, history books usually talk about military tactics and cavalry pursuit. But here's the truth. It wasn't military defeat that ended Geronimo's resistance. It was agricultural destruction. Crook's scouts, many of them Apache themselves, which is its own tragedy, systematically found and destroyed every hidden cornfield and cache they could locate. Geronimo surrendered because his people were starving, not because they had been defeated in battle, not because they were cowards or broken, but because someone had finally figured out the secret. The Apache had built their independence on corn, and if you destroyed the corn, you destroyed the independence. The last free Apache were taken to reservations, where the government thought the story would end, where they thought Apache culture and agricultural knowledge would simply fade away under the pressure of assimilation policies and government rations. But grandmothers can be remarkably stubborn, and coffee cans make excellent seed banks, and some stories refuse to end just because someone in Washington decides they should. The reservation years from 1886 to 1930 brought what you might call cultural genocide by bureaucracy. Government agents distributed white flour and lard, declaring traditional cornbread primitive and unsanitary. And this word choice matters, because if you can make something seem dirty, backwards, uncivilized, then you're not destroying a culture, you're helping people modernize. That's how colonization always justifies itself. Apache children at Carlisle Indian School, which had the absolutely chilling motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man," were punished for speaking about corn ceremonies. Imagine being beaten for talking about bread. Agricultural instructors insisted on teaching wheat farming in lands that were completely unsuited for wheat, because wheat was civilized and corn was savage. The logic was circular and cruel. Grow European crops to become European people, and if the crops fail, well, that just proves you're not trying hard enough to be civilized. But here's what the government agents and school administrators and agricultural instructors didn't understand. Apache grandmothers are forces of nature. They became underground revolutionaries, maintaining heritage corn varieties in hidden gardens, teaching granddaughters to grind corn on metates in root cellars, passing down recipes in whispered Apache words during midnight kitchen gatherings. They turned every kitchen into a resistance cell and every meal into an act of cultural preservation. Emma Gonzalez, born at San Carlos in 1910, remembered her grandmother Maria's defiance in an oral history recorded in the 1980s. Listen to how she describes this. She kept 5 kinds of corn seeds in a buried coffee can behind the outhouse. Every spring she'd plant them among the government wheat, telling the agent they were flowers. Flowers. I love that. The absolute audacity of telling a government agricultural agent that corn is decorative flowers. And apparently it worked, because the agents couldn't tell the difference or didn't care enough to look closely. Emma continued. She taught me that each color of corn had a purpose. White for ceremonies, yellow for daily bread, blue for strength, red for healing, and multicolored for celebration. She'd grind them on a metate she kept hidden under her bed, and we'd make cornbread at night when the agents were sleeping, adding mesquite flour and wild herbs that made it taste like freedom. That last phrase kills me. Taste like freedom. Because that's what it was. Every grinding session, every midnight baking, every carefully hidden seed was an assertion that we are still here. We are still Apache. You have not erased us. This went on for decades. Through the Depression, through World War II, through the termination era when the government tried to end tribal sovereignty altogether. Grandmothers kept seeds in coffee cans and cookie tins and mason jars. They taught granddaughters in whispers and in darkness. They maintained varieties of corn that hadn't been planted openly in 50 years. The revival began in the 1970s, and it came from an unexpected place, the American Indian movement. Agem was fighting for rights and sovereignty and recognition, but they also inspired a cultural renaissance across Indian country. Young people who had been taught to be ashamed of their heritage suddenly wanted to learn everything their grandparents knew. Michael Horse, an Apache agricultural activist, established the first tribal seed bank in 1978. And when he put out the call for heritage corn varieties, elders showed up with their coffee cans and cookie tins and mason jars. Some varieties hadn't been planted in 50 years, but they remained viable, protected in traditional storage methods using diatomaceous earth from ancient lake beds. The ancestors had known what they were doing. The 1990s brought something unexpected, scientific vindication. Nutritionists studying traditional Native American foods discovered that Apache blue cornbread, made with ash water and wild seeds, the way Emma's grandmother had taught her, contained more protein, more antioxidants, and more essential minerals than any commercial bread product. The primitive, unsanitary food that government agents had tried to stamp out was actually nutritionally superior to what they had been pushing. And this is where the story gets wonderfully ironic. Today, Apache Cornbread has conquered unlikely territories. Ramona Farms, run by Ramona and Terry. Button, who are Pima but use traditional Apache corn. Varieties, sells traditional Apache corn products worldwide. They get orders from Tokyo restaurants in Berlin, bakeries and Michelin-starred restaurants in Paris. The bread that warriors once mocked, that government agents called primitive, is now gourmet food commanding premium prices. The Mescalero Apache tribe operates a successful agritourism program where visitors pay $300 to learn traditional corn cultivation and preparation techniques from elder teachers. People fly in from around the world to spend a weekend learning to grind corn on a metate and bake cornbread in an outdoor oven. They're paying for the privilege of doing what Apache grandmothers did in secret for generations. But here's my favorite part of the modern story. And it's so perfectly absurd that you'll think I'm making it up. NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, included Apache Blue cornbread in their experimental menu for Mars missions. They recognized that indigenous agricultural knowledge might be crucial for space colonization. The same government that once tried to destroy Apache corn cultivation now wants to take it to Mars. Think about the poetry of that for a second. Corn that survived genocide might help humans survive on another planet. Knowledge that was punished in boarding schools might keep astronauts alive millions of miles from Earth. The circle isn't just unbroken, it's expanded to include other worlds. Young Apache farmers like Twyla Casadore use Instagram to share traditional recipes, gaining millions of views for videos of cornbread preparation that their ancestors were once forbidden to practice. She films herself grinding corn on her great-grandmother's metate, mixing it with traditional ingredients, baking it the old way, and millions of people watch. Some are Apache, reconnecting with heritage. Some are food enthusiasts. Some are just people who love a good story. But they're all participating in something that broke an arrow. That young warrior who mocked cornbread in 1492 could never have imagined. The bird food became survival food, became resistance food, became gourmet food, became space food. The simple mixture of corn, water, salt, and patience carries 5 centuries of adaptation, resistance, and triumph. And here's what I want you to understand as we close this story. This isn't just about bread. It's about the fact that cultures adapt, survive, and thrive in ways that their oppressors never anticipate. The government agents thought they were destroying Apache culture by distributing white flour. They were actually just making Apache grandmothers more creative about where they hid their metates. The boarding schools thought they were erasing Apache identity by punishing children who spoke about corn ceremonies. They were actually just ensuring that those ceremonies would be practiced in secret, would become even more precious for being forbidden. Every attempt to erase Apache corn culture just made it more resilient, more precious, more central to what it means to be Apache. And in the end, the culture that was supposed to disappear is teaching the rest of the world, including space agencies, how to survive. So the next time you eat cornbread, any cornbread, remember that you're eating a food with a story of warriors who mocked it, grandmothers who preserved it, children who were punished for it, and descendants who conquered the world with it. From the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to Mars, from bird food to space food, this is the improbable impossible. Absolutely true story of how Apache cornbread refused to die, and that coffee can buried behind Emma's grandmother's outhouse. It held more than seeds. It held 5 centuries of defiance, adaptation, and hope. It held the promise that cultures can survive anything if they're stubborn enough and creative enough and love themselves enough to keep planting seeds in secret. That's the real recipe. Corn, water, salt, patience, and an absolutely unbreakable determination to still be here tomorrow, no matter what anyone thinks about it.